What's up, YouTube? This is Mobile. I'm back again with another video. Today, what we'll be doing, I'll be doing a little bit of a follow-up to that book review I did about 7 months ago, so late January, early February. I did a book review of the book Angels, Archons, and Aliens by Ambrose Andriano. I wanted to do a follow-up just to make a few clarifications, offer some additional points. That I couldn't have done in that earlier video because there was actually a lot of content in that book. It's a very long book, so I couldn't actually have gone through the whole thing and answered every question and etc. etc. So first, I want to make some clarifications on my position. Maybe someone might be a bit confused on what I think about this whole UFO UAP phenomenon. Um, like I said in the previous video regarding this, I said that I think the phenomenon, as Mr. Ambrose Andiano correctly has said, is very much identifiable with ancient experiences of various people from different parts of the world, their experiences with gods and spirits and all those types of things. The phenomenon is very much identical to that. Um, Also, I think that because of that, definitely some part of the phenomenon is benevolent and does involve some angelic entities. But by and large, I think the phenomenon as presented through represented through various UFO religions which have popped up because of this, I think that is mostly demonic. I think the recent talk of non-human craft is some kind of psychological operation, because I do not think that the people in charge of this world currently are angelic people. They're not good people, and therefore the powers that would be directing them would definitely not be angelic. They would definitely be evil. So in the next couple of years, 2024, 2025, 2026, don't take what happens to be something that is going to be good or beneficial to mankind. A lot of what's going to happen in the next couple of years, if this phenomenon accelerates the way I think it's going to accelerate, hopefully it doesn't, hopefully I'm wrong about that, then it's not going to be very good. It's going to involve a lot of new religions, new religious experiences, which are of a demonic kind, not involving benevolent entities, but malevolent entities. So yeah, that's my position on this. I know I talked a bit about maybe some of these entities might be humans who were transported to another planet during the flood. I gave examples of like Elijah and Enoch and the story of Zosimus. You can go and watch the full video to get a deeper understanding of that. And I still think that might be a possibility, but just to explain some of the creatures that are mentioned in the various stories that people tell about these entities. But by and large, I think it's mostly a phenomenon involving non-human entities who are of a cosmic intelligence. So we're talking about cosmic intelligence with power, and power could involve various occult techniques or just basically a very advanced technology. But aside from that, so that's just mainly my position on it, is that it's mostly powerful cosmic entities. But um, regarding the idea that these creatures are gonna give us a new revelation or a new understanding of human history, um, it might give us a little bit of a better understanding of the past, of how people, what exactly they are, how, in terms of like their physical makeup, etc. But whether saying whether the angels or demons, I think, is enough, because we don't really have a good grasp of what they actually are. Like, I don't think that trying to class them as all immaterial or all of them are material is very useful, because the phenomenon is um, very varied. It's varied in terms of the types of entities you encounter. Some of these entities are physical; they can touch, hold you, pick you up, do various things with you, and some of them are clearly immaterial. um, being able to move through walls very easily, etc. So I think that um, just talking about them in terms of them being cosmic intelligences, and that means they are a specific class of creature which God created to administer the cosmos in a different way than what humans were meant to do. That is the best way of speaking about them, and that's where you get, you can talk about them as angels or demons. Um, so aside from that, I also wanted to talk about reincarnation and pre-existence of souls. This forms a very big part of the book, where Andriano tries to argue that because in contemporary ufology and people's encounters with these entities, you tend to find you know, these entities affirming things like the reincarnation and the pre-existence of souls. Therefore, we need to consider the possibility that this might be true. As I argued in my video, we really don't, because these two ideas, the reincarnation and the pre-existence of souls, require substance dualism, which is not a very philosophically coherent position, because of things like the interaction problem. On top of that, they don't really mesh well with the worldview of the scriptures. As some people have argued, various scholars have shown that the early Christians definitely believed the soul could die, and that implies a kind of hylomorphic dualism, or even physicalism, which actually links the soul and the body inextricably. And that makes sense if you look at someone like, for example, Saint Cyril of Alexandria. He talks about a person as being a composite of soul and body, that the human nature is a composite of soul and body. So if it's a composite of soul and body united in one, so that it's one nature, then you can't really have it where you are not really your body, but you're like a ghost piloting a meat suit, where you're like a ghost who was created, I don't know how long ago, and then you've been through various bodies, and then you're sort of like clothing, like the body is more like a clothing item for your soul, rather than something that is inextricably linked to your soul, right? And so that's why it's just reincarnation and the pre-existence of souls are just not compatible with Christianity, and on top of that, they are philosophically incoherent. So we don't really need to take them seriously, regardless of whether or not some cosmic intelligence tells you that, oh, so and so is a reincarnation of this other person in the past. No, we don't really need to take that as a very serious position. It doesn't really matter whether or not Hindus and other pagans took reincarnation and the pre-existence of soul seriously. Paganism is clearly a deformed religious system, which is sort of like a way of human beings trying to deal with the with the post-fall world, um, and the way it works. But clearly they were very much limited due to the noetic effects of sin. So I'm not gonna take that as a serious position that needs to be. So if you we're just gonna go through the book right now, and we're just gonna go through the book right now, and you're gonna look at the various in his which Father Seraphim Rose makes in his book. So we're gonna start reading the book from we're gonna start reading the book from the this paragraph here that I've highlighted. So starting, he says, when juxtaposing everything in pop culture against his own version of Christianity, Rose says the future world and humanity as seen by science fiction, ostensibly in terms of projections from present day scientific discoveries. In actuality, these projections correspond quite remarkably to the everyday reality of occult and overtly demonic experiences throughout the ages. The reasons that Rose gives to show why the flying saucers are a distinctly demonic and occult phenomenon are because, number one, demons can communicate by mental telepathy, demons can fly, demons can materialize and dematerialize, demons can psychically transform the appearances of things, demons can travel at high speeds, demons can override and possess bodies, demons expand spiritual philosophies which transcend religious distinctions, demons teach that there will come a day when mankind evolves into a state that is not held down by the bonds of material existence. Rose concludes this list by saying all of these are the standard practices and claims of sorcerers and demons. The presuppositions applied here are easily refutable by the majority of what he describes as being evidence of demonic activity is a double standard which also happens to apply to what he himself would view as angelic or divine activity. Now, before we continue with the argument, let's actually go and read what Father Rose said on page 103 of his book, Orthodoxy and the Religion of the Future. So it says, the future evolved beings in science fiction literature are invariably seen as having outgrown the limitations of present day humanity, in particular, the limitations of personality. Like the quote God of science fiction, man has also become strangely impersonal. In Arthur C. Clarke's at Childhood's End, the new race of humans has the appearance of children, but faces devoid of personality. They are about to be guided into yet higher evolutionary transformations on the way to becoming absorbed in the impersonal quote overmind. In general, the literature of science fiction, in direct contrast to Christianity, but exactly in accordance with some schools of Eastern thought, sees evolutionary advancement and spirituality in terms of increased impersonality. The future world and humanity are seen by science fiction ostensibly in terms of projections from present-day scientific discoveries. In actuality, however, these projections correspond quite remarkably to the everyday reality of occult and overtly demonic experience throughout the ages. Among the characteristics of the quote highly evolved creatures of the future are communication by mental telepathy, ability to fly, materialize and dematerialize, transform the appearance of things, or create illusory scenes and creatures by pure thought, travel at speeds far beyond any modern technology to take the possession of the bodies of earthmen, and the expounding of a spiritual philosophy which is, quote, beyond all religions and holds promise of a state where, quote, advanced intelligences will no longer be dependent on matter. All these are the standard practices and claims of sorcerers and demons. A recent history of science fiction notes that a persistent aspect of the vision of science fiction is the desire to transcend normal experience through the presentation of the characters and events that transgress the conditions of space and time as we know them. So, what exactly is Father Rose talking about here? Um, is it exactly the same thing as is mentioned here? No, because number seven is not exactly compatible with what Andriano is going to argue, and I'll show you. So Andriano says the first is refuted on the account of the young Samuel and Eli, where 3 times Samuel was contacted telepathically by a foreign non-demonic entity. If Rose is correct and mental telepathy is inherently demonic, then Samuel was talking with a demon. Um, this of course ignores the whole book up until this point, which is talking about this idea of science fiction as being depersonalized um, entities, people who are depersonalized, sort of in that state of nirvana where there is no personality, where there is no character, there is no distinguishing characteristic that individualizes anybody. So this ability to communicate by mental telepathy is, of course, not as like a slam dunk idea that is like being taken in a vacuum, but is part of what these things are using to deceive people, right? So just because God or the angels could talk to you mentally in a mental in a way that's using telepathy, that doesn't mean that all uses of telepathy are good. And that's the point. Just like all speech isn't good, you know, that doesn't mean that all speech is evil. Rather, um, some speech can be used for good and evil, right? The second is refuted by the ascension of Christ. Again, it's not in a vacuum. And, you can go through the first like first like four, actually five. The first five are obviously not in a vacuum, right? But now, for the sixth, he's going to say, I will assume that Rose was being sloppy with his language and intended to suggest that demons are marked by the will to manipulate to unholy ends and not the ability to override, which also applies to omnipotent God. Which, while it's true that there's no biblical accounts of a divine possession the same as the demonic possession is described, this does not mean that God or angels do not have the ability or will never have the will to do such a thing, nor does it mean that there is never a conceivable instance where it will be positive for the sake of protection, except that no, the overriding of free will, demonic possession in that sense cannot happen, right? In terms of an angel or God doing it, um, simply because it's immoral, right? It's just immoral to try and take over a person's psyche in that way, um, where you try to take over the person's body and try and like control them. And it involves a lot of force. It's violent. It's destructive to the soul. So no, this is not something that could ever conceivably be used for a positive direction or for the sake of protection. Um, then he says, concerning the seventh, Jesus' own core teachings about love could easily be described as a religious philosophy that transcends denominational distinctions, hence why Gentiles of varying beliefs so readily accepted it worldwide. No, no, this is not the case. Because Jesus' own core teachings are, first of all, linked to the Old Testament. In other words, they're linked to Israelite religion, right? And on top of that, everybody in the Gentile world who accepted Christianity accepted it according to the denomination which proselytized them. Whether it's Protestant, Anglican, Orthodox, any Gentile who accepts Christianity also accepts other core religious aspects, things like the Trinity, things like the resurrection. These are not um, these do not transcend religious boundaries. They don't. Um, these are very much universalist in the sense that they make a universal claim about exclusivity. Muslims could not believe it. Jews could not believe it. So it does not transcend religious bounds. What Father Rose is talking about is, of course, a very syncretic kind of religious teaching that is very much common with the accounts of ufology, where you have syncretic religious teachings, right? And then lastly, the idea that mankind will reach a state of where it transcends the limitations of the flesh is an orthodox teaching called theosis. No, theosis is not at all like the teachings that ufology talks about, where, as Father Rose described it, an intelligence, right, um, is going to leave matter completely. You're talking about abandoning matter completely, not overcoming the desires of the flesh, as he's going to talk about here, right? Overcoming the desires of the flesh is about conquering the body, right? Conquering the body to make it your body, right? Where you have complete and utter control of your body. That's what it's about. It's not about leaving the flesh behind completely. That's just not what the resurrection is about. And we know this because in Pauline theology, in the theology of St. Paul, which is actually the theology of Christ, the resurrection is distinctly is linked to, right? It is linked to the current body that you have. It will also be the same as the resurrected body. And we can see this clearly in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 42. So it will be with the resurrection of the dead. This is after he's talking about sowing and reaping. the body that is sown perishable, it is raised imperishable. There is a direct continuity. There is no leaving behind of matter. So it doesn't make any sense to talk about. It doesn't make any sense to talk about um, Father Rose somehow forgetting about theosis. He's not forgetting about theosis here, because the teachings of that are found in ufology, which are consistent with Far Eastern teachings about transcending matter and leaving the body behind, those are very much contradictory to what St. Paul teaches about the resurrection. So there is no forgetting of theosis here. It's not at all consistent with Orthodox theosis. So yeah, his arguments against Father Rose, they're not very good. They're very lackluster. They don't take into account the wider point, which is that in Father Rose's work, he talks a lot about various encounters um, with these entities, which leave people confused, scared, paranoid, leaving them turning to suicidal ideation, alcohol, drugs to try and cope, and only in some cases where people rebuild their faith with Christ, not in some sort of ufological reassessment of the Christian faith, but a simple and humble faith with Christ, they that's where they find peace. That's where they find peace, right? So this phenomenon in a lot of cases leaves people confused and paranoid, you know, dejected. In places, it has negative effects on mental and spiritual health, right? So obviously, you're going to associate that more with the demonic than you are going to associate it with the angelic, right? Um, People who are experiencing encounters of the second or third kind, those are the people who are suffering a lot in most cases, right? So you're going to actually associate this more with um you're going to associate this more with the demonic than with the angelic, because it seems like the cases where it is demonic outweighs the cases where it is angelic, right? And I'm also going to talk about you know something that's mentioned a lot in this book is trying to um, oppose the historical literal reading of the text of scripture with the allegorical spiritual method of interpreting the scripture. But even Calvinists are forced often to use the allegorical and spiritual method as much as they try to avoid it. It's because the Bible often allegorizes itself. For example, Zechariah 6 being clearly referencing Isaiah 11 in a way that is trying to use these languages to create a narrative about the nature of the Messiah, right? So you can clearly see the Bible allegorizing itself at many points. Um, some things are clearly written in a way that is not historical, but meant to be read in an allegorical and spiritual manner. Like the whole book of Revelation, for example. So you know the idea that these two realities are opposed to one another is not the case. I mean, he, for example, mentions Saint Gregory of Nyssa, who says regarding the death of the firstborn in his writing The Life of Moses. St. Gregory says, "It does not seem good to me to pass this interpretation by without further contemplation. How would a concept worthy of God be preserved in the description of what happened if one looked only to the history? The Egyptian acts unjustly, and in his place is punished his newborn child, who in his infancy cannot discern what is good and what is not. His life has no experience of evil, for infancy is not capable of passion. He does not know to distinguish between his right hand and his left. The infant lifts his eyes only to his mother's nipple, and tears are the sole perceptible sign of his sadness. And if he obtains anything which his nature desires, he signifies his pleasure by smiling. Such one now pays the penalty of his father's wickedness. Where is justice? Where is piety? Where is holiness? Where is Ezekiel, who cries, "The man who has sinned is the man who must die, and a son is not to suffer for the sins of his father"? How can the history so contradict reason? Therefore, as we look for the true spiritual meaning, seeking to determine whether the event took place typologically, we should be prepared to believe what the lawgiver has taught through the things said. The teaching is this: When through virtue one comes to grips with any evil, he must completely destroy the first beginnings of evil. Right. So, Saint Gregory is using this part of the is using this part of the death of the firstborn that we see where God kills all the firstborn of Egypt to gain a spiritual understanding of it, about how one must defeat the beginnings of evil in order to defeat evil, right? But it's very clear to me, at least, that St. Gregory does not think that this whole history is not history and instead a myth. He calls it a history, right? Um, so to me, what he's actually doing is trying to understand why God would do something like this, right? And it seems to me rather like, if we go and read previously when he talks about the hardening of Pharaoh's heart, he says, "Let us not be astonished if the history says that the rod of virtue did these things to the Egyptians, but it also says that the tyrant was hardened by God. Now, how could he be condemned if he were disposed by divine constraint to be stubborn and obstinate? Somewhere the divine apostle also expresses the same thought. Since they refused to see it was rational to acknowledge God, he abandoned them to shameful passions, speaking about those who commit sodomy and those who disgrace themselves by dishonorable and unmentionable profligacy." But even if what has been said before is so stated by scripture, and God does this in this way entirely give up to dishonorable passions the one who gives himself up to them, still Pharaoh is not hardened by the divine will, nor is the frog like life fashioned by virtue. For if this were to be willed by the divine nature, then certainly any human choice would fall into line in every case, so that no distinction between virtue and vice in life could be observed. In other words, what St. Gregory is saying is that, okay, if this was according to the history, like God really hardened his heart, then every human being, every human choice would fall into line. God could make us do anything, and there would be no real distinction between virtue and vice. You couldn't actually tell the difference between right and wrong. In other words, like I've said before, you destroy the basis for justice. This, by the way, refutes what Andriano said regarding you know, someone's will being completely overtaken, really overtaken by an evil entity, right? Even in demonic possession, right? You can't really say that the person, when the person's will is completely overtaken, right? You can't really look at the person and like bring proper justice to what they do, right? You have to like remove the demon first to see what the person is in terms of their free will. In the same way, you couldn't, if it were like genuinely possible for us to really consider um, what happened to Pharaoh as something of a possession, even though it doesn't look like it, then the possession of people could be subtle, and you would not be able to tell when someone is really doing something or when it's a demon forcing them to do evil, and you kind of blur the lines between right and wrong, and then how do you actually administer justice when someone does something wrong, right? So clearly, he's saying that the hardening is something that was passive and not an active something. Right? It is not something that was active in the divine nature, but something that was passive, where God gave Pharaoh over to his own will and to his own stubbornness. But this clearly is he is clearly grappling with the history of this text. He's not treating it as something like, for example, Aesop's fables, right? He's treating it as a real history which needs to be understood in light of the divine inspiration that it was, that the divine inspiration that it clearly has, the divine inspiration that brought it to us today for us to be able to read it in the churches, right? Andriano often quotes Origen, who says that unless those physical walls bore the figure of spiritual walls, I do not think the books of Jewish history would ever have been handed down by the apostles who teach to the disciples of Christ who came to teach peace so that they could be read in the churches, right? So unless this history was meant to be read allegorically, right? Unless this history was intentionally, written down, recorded, so that we could use it allegorically to learn from it, then we wouldn't have it. And that's something that's agreeable. That's obvious, right? We wouldn't have the history of the Jews if we couldn't learn from it. If it didn't teach us a lot, if we couldn't consistently learn from the history of the Jews, not just about how we ought to behave spiritually, but about the nature of God, about the Messiah, we wouldn't have it. It wouldn't benefit us to have it, right? So, but that doesn't mean that these histories didn't happen or that God wasn't involved in them, right? All that it means is that they are there to teach us, right? And so it's not evil to consider them historical. What is evil is to just use is to like consider them apart from what they can teach us, right? It's what's evil is to actually consider them apart from what they can teach us. So when he's asking about how an infant can be punished for the father's sin, well, the infant is not being punished for the father's sin. The infant is here dying for the sake of meeting the gods of Egypt, right? So you could actually look at these firstborn as sort of a symbolic destruction in order to defeat the gods of Egypt. If you read Exodus 12:12, it says, "For I will go through the land of Egypt on that night and fatally strike all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn to the animals, and against all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgment. I am the Lord, I am Yahweh." So he is defeating the gods of Egypt by symbolically using the firstborn as a way to destroy the gods of Egypt. So it's for the sake of defeating the firstborn primarily, and not really as like a punishment on Pharaoh. And by defeating the gods of Egypt, he has God basically destroys Egypt in order then to free the children of Israel. Um, that's that's the history, right? The history is the defeat of the gods of Egypt. That's the main goal, the destruction of Egypt by destroying their gods, not punishing Pharaoh. Well, Pharaoh is a god in Egypt, so he also ends up dying later in the narrative. Um, but as we see, the whole point of the plagues is to defeat the gods of Egypt in succession, right? And so I think that that's what's really happening here, as opposed to some sort of like very literal understanding of, oh, God kills the firstborn just for just to make Pharaoh sad. No, it's actually about defeating the gods of Egypt, if you can really see it in the passage, right? And so I don't think that the historical literal reality is opposed to the allegorical reading. The allegorical reading is not a what you might call a solve or a get out of jail free card for the historical literal reality. It's not a plaster on top, right? It's something that enhances the historical literal reality. And regarding that, I'm going to actually try and answer what the question that Andriano poses in the book, right? So um, he he says, I ask my fellow Christians what David Bentley Hart only alludes to, that is to prove to me that Yahweh, so he's talking about the God of the Old Testament, is morally distinguishable from Satan by making a convincing moral argument with the Old Testament daughter, using the character of Jesus Christ as the moral standard of divine love, but making no reference to the New Testament itself. I don't know why this caveat is put there, because I don't think it's really going to assist him, right? So without making reference to the New Testament seems to be like a way of like, I don't know if he's trying to deflect from something or what, but we can clearly see um, that the God of the Old Testament in the laws that he gives is actually consistent with the moral character of Jesus Christ, and we can show that Leviticus 19 um, verses 9 to 17, where it says, "When you reap the harvest of your land, you're not to reap the very edges of your field or gather the gleanings of your harvest. Um, you must not strip the young yard or gather its fallen grapes. Leave them for the poor and the foreigner," right? Assist the poor and the foreigner. Remember the poor and the foreigner. Remember those who are less fortunate than you. Sounds a lot like Jesus. You must not steal. You must not lie or deceive one another. This is just very basic good things. You must not sell falsely by my name and so profane the name of your God. I am the Lord. You must not defraud your neighbor or rob him. You must not withhold until morning the wages due a hired hand. Don't exploit people. Sounds a lot like Jesus. You must not curse the deaf or place a stumbling block before the blind, but you shall fear the Lord your God. I am the Lord. Right? Do not place a stumbling block before the blind. Right? Do not try and place stumbling blocks before people to stop. And this can be interpreted literally, but we can talk about people, for example, Jesus talks about people who try and place a stumbling block before his children, right? Don't do that, because otherwise you deserve a millstone to be tied around your neck and to be thrown into the sea. That's what you need. That used to happen to those who place a stumbling block before children, right? So you can clearly see the character of Christ here, right? You must not pervert justice. You must not show partiality to the poor or favoritism to the rich. You are to judge your neighbor fairly. Love your neighbor. It's there, right? You must not spread slander among your people. You must not engage the life of your neighbor. Always remember your neighbor. Love your neighbor. You must not harbor hatred against your brother in your heart. Don't hate your brother. That sounds a lot like Christ. Christ gives the same exact commandments. Directly rebuke your neighbor so that you'll not incur guilt on account of him. Do not seek revenge or bear a grudge against any of your people, but love your neighbor as yourself. I'm sure Jesus Christ quotes this. In fact, he does quote this in Mark chapter 12. The page will just load, but it doesn't really matter. Everybody has heard love your neighbor as yourself. That is something that didn't come from Christ. He's not the one who said that, although he did say that because he is God. But it comes literally from the Old Testament. So the Old Testament is literally supported by the New. Christ is consistent with the God of the Old Testament. So the moral character of Yahweh is far more moral than Satan. He is a very moral God, very just God, a very loving God, a God who clearly loves his people. He loves his people so much. If you read the Old Testament, God shows love in so many different ways. But in order to sort of explain this, if you go and read in the book, you can go and read in the book. He says that there are actually two Yahwehs. Let's see, two lords, two different gods in the book. So he says entities Ra and Kuo, I think that's how it's pronounced, said that there are actually two Yahwehs in communication with the Israelites, which they conflate into one. One was a positively polarized shepherd, like being associated with a federation group known as the Guardians, and one was a negatively polarized warlord originating from the constellation of Orion, who landed on Earth around 620 BC. And if we actually go and see what exactly was said here, it's from the raw material. I don't know. I know this book is somewhere. If you're gonna go read it, I wouldn't read it. Probably you won't get much more information out of it than what you read in like UFO circles, which are freely available online. You don't have to go and buy this whole book. It says another channel entity, Rain Ramtha, makes a distinction between the benevolent Yahweh and malevolent Yehovah. So Jehovah or Yehovah is the bad one, and the good one is Yahweh. I'm pretty sure those are just two different transliterations of the same word, two different transliterations of the Tetragrammaton. So I'm not really sure how you're actually going to make sense of that. And that's really the problem here. You can't honestly and rationally and reasonably distinguish Jehovah and Yahweh in the Bible, because there's no clear place where you can clearly see one is different from the other, right? And they can say, oh, that's because they conflated it. Okay, then how come Jesus never makes mention of this conflation? He doesn't say, oh, this part here is not my father, but this part is my father, or this part here is the good God and this part here is the bad God. Jesus never makes mention of that. Why? There's no reason that can be rationally given, because there is no good reason why one would actually come to believe that. So yeah, and that's the main problem with this with two Yahweh's hypothesis, is that there's no real way one could come to that conclusion without somebody else telling you. And on what basis are we going to trust them? What epistemological method did they use to come to that conclusion? You know, certainly not time travel. As I said before in the previous thing, time travel is just not possible. And as I said, time dilation is not time travel. So just because you exist in a region of space where time moves slower than other places doesn't mean that you can actually time travel, right? You can only go, that would just only be moving, being able to be, relative to some other part of the universe. You are more in the past than they are, and they're in the future relative to you if you're living in a place which is time dilated, right? So you couldn't actually go to the past of that place. So it wouldn't be possible for them to have been in the past, to go, travel into the past to try and get that information. So they would have had to be on Earth during that time and have accurate recorded data showing that, oh, these were two different entities who interacted with the Jewish people, right? And then if, at least according to ufology, if Jesus is one of these guys, how come he never told us that? That would have been very useful information, actually. Would have solved a lot of problems. A lot of problems would have been solved if we had that information, but we didn't get that information until later entities come and tell us. Why is that? Seems very weird. Yeah, so um there isn't really any good reason to believe that Yahweh in the Bible, or the Lord, the God in the Bible, is um, morally in competition or morally opposite to Jesus Christ. I think they are the same God, and they are both loving, just, merciful, holy, all of those attributes. Divided Trinity. One undivided Trinity united, who is love, God is love, and who dwells in the Christians today and expresses his love through his divine work in creation. Um, so yeah, it is no reason, there is no reason to believe that there is any moral opposition. So that's the end of the video. That's my follow-up. If you have any additional questions you want to ask me about this book, if you have read it, I don't know if anyone has read it. I saw the video last I checked had 160 views. I don't know who watched through the whole video. It was like an hour long. So I don't know who actually took the time to watch through an hour long of content like that. But if you have any questions regarding the book or regarding what I think about UAPs, feel free to ask them in the comment section below. Please be sure to like, share, and subscribe if you enjoyed the content. And I'll see you in the next video. Thank you. Take care. Goodbye.